It was a simple, unexpected remark at dinner that silenced David, a devoted father. His 4-year-old daughter Lucy looked up from her spaghetti and said something that caused his fork to freeze in the air. The words were innocent, taken from a conversation she had probably overheard, but to David they had a deeper, more disturbing meaning. As a silence fell over the dinner table, David found it hard to comprehend how such a small voice could cause such enormous unrest in him. After a long day of work, David was tired and hungry. It was a dinner like any other, sitting at the kitchen table with his wife Emily and his daughter Lucy. They had been talking about their day together when Lucy suddenly mumbled something under her breath that David wasn't sure if he had heard correctly at first. But there was no doubt about Lucy's words. That night, David lay awake with Lucy's words echoing in his head. He hadn't thought about his father in years, let alone the name Lucy muttered. It was a name that brought back memories of silent arguments and terrible moments from his youth. David knew he couldn't let it go, but he didn't want to alarm Emily either. The next morning, David was distracted at work, and his thoughts kept wandering to the conversation at the dinner table. He decided to call his mother, hoping she could shed some light on Lucy's innocent but disturbing words. "Mom, I have something to ask you," he said, trying to sound nonchalant. There was a tense pause on the other end of the line. "David, is everything all right?" his mother asked, worried in her voice. He hesitated, unsure of how much to tell her. "Lucy said something last night, something that reminded me of Dad," he finally admitted. His mother's silence was telling and only made David's sense of unease worse. "David, some things are better left in the past," she replied softly, but David could hear the tremor in her voice. "I need to know, Mom. It's important," he insisted. With a sigh, his mother agreed to meet him later that week, but she said she didn't want to talk about it over the phone. His mother's reluctance only made him more worried. As the days passed, David became more and more nervous. Lucy's innocent talk now seemed to be full of hidden pitfalls, every word a potential dagger in his chest. Emily noticed his distraction but didn't insist, trusting that he would open up when he was ready. David knew he had to be careful. He didn't want to conjure up old ghosts without first understanding their impact. When he finally sat down with his mother a few days later, the tension was immediately palpable. "David, your father, he had his secrets," she began, choosing her words carefully. "Some were meant to protect you, but others were a burden." David listened intently, feeling more shocked with every word. "I never wanted you to get involved in his world," his mother continued, her voice with a hint of regret. David's mind raced, trying to piece together fragments of his childhood memories. "But why would Lucy mention that name?" he asked, to bridge the gap between past and present. His mother's eyes flickered with something he couldn't quite place. Fear, perhaps, or sadness. "There are connections we didn't know about," she said cryptically. "Things that may have popped up without us knowing." David felt a shiver run down his spine. The more his mother revealed, the more he realized how much he didn't know about his own family. And the more determined he became to find out the truth, no matter what the cost. David returned home with a heavy heart, determination overshadowed by a growing fear. He decided to distance himself from Emily and Lucy, fearing that he would repeat his father's mistakes. Every interaction felt like walking on thin ice. "It's for their own good," he whispered to himself, evading Emily's worried gaze. His absence from the dinner table became more frequent, the once warm household now filled with an unsettling silence. Emily tried to talk to him and sensed that something was very wrong. "David, we need to discuss this," she begged them, but he shook his head and insisted that he had to figure something out first. "I can't explain it now," he said, avoiding her eyes. Emily's frustration grew, but she held back and gave him space, hoping he would eventually open up. The distance between them widened, leaving Emily feeling helpless. David avoided talking to Lucy entirely, as he felt it would be better to keep his distance for the time being. Her innocent questions and bright eyes now seemed like potential landmines. "Daddy, why don't we play anymore?" Lucy asked one evening, her voice breaking his heart. "I'm busy, sweetheart," he replied, forcing a smile. He retreated to his office, and his guilt gnawed at him as he closed the door. Although he missed his daughter dearly, David felt it necessary to stay away to protect her and himself. The nights were the hardest, with Lucy's laughter coming from the other room, a painful reminder of the bond he sacrificed. "I have to do this," he muttered, as he stared at old family photos. The silence of his self-imposed isolation was deafening, every second without Lucy eroding his resolve. David's heart ached, but he resolved to uncover the truth about his father's past, despite the growing distance from his family. He spent nights sifting through old documents and making discreet phone calls. "I need answers," he said to himself. "Each revelation is a small piece of the puzzle." The more he learned, the greater his determination became, but also the isolation of those he loved the most. David overheard Lucy mention his estranged brother's name to Emily as he walked past their conversation. "Mommy, who's Uncle Mark?" she asked innocently. David froze, his heart pounded. Emily looked confused. "Where did you hear that name, sweetheart?" Lucy shrugged. "I don't know. I just heard it." David clenched his fists and quickly walked away before they noticed him. The name brought with it a new wave of unease, adding to his already growing anxiety. He left home early and returned late, avoiding his wife and daughter to focus on his research. The house was quiet when he left, and dark when he returned. "Late again?" asked Emily one night, her voice filled with concern. David nodded and avoided her gaze. "Just work," he lied. He spent nights in the library and in old family places, looking for clues that could fit the puzzle of his past together. Despite his attempts, his mother continued to dodge his questions, frustrating his attempts to get more information. "Mom, I need to know more about Dad and Mark," he insisted over the phone. "David, please, let it be," she replied, her voice strained. "But why don't you tell me?" he insisted. "There are some things you shouldn't tell," she said firmly, ending the conversation. David's frustration grew. The answers he was looking for slipped further and further away. David wrestled with the secret. He felt increasingly isolated from his family and weighed down by the mystery. He found it difficult to concentrate at work. His thoughts kept wandering to his father's hidden past. At home, the distance between him and Emily grew larger and greater. "David, you're shutting us out," Emily said one night. He sighed. "I've got to figure this out first." The weight of the secrets weighed heavily on him and added to his isolation. He vowed to find answers, determined to protect his loved ones from the shadows of his father's past. David spent sleepless nights sifting through old letters, files, and photographs. "I'm not going to let this destroy us," he whispered to himself. Every piece of information was a small victory, but the bigger picture remained elusive. His determination grew, even as his bonds with Emily and Lucy seemed to weaken more by the day. One Saturday morning, David heard Lucy call his brother Mark's name again as she prepared to leave. "Mommy, Uncle Mark said he'd bring me a new book next time," Lucy said cheerfully. David's heart skipped a beat. Emily looked startled. "Baby, When did you see Uncle Mark? Lucy's answer was muffled, and David froze, straining to hear more. The shock of hearing Mark's name made David dizzy, his thoughts racing. He listened in shock as Lucy told Emily that she had met Mark, whom David hadn't seen since he was a teenager. Uncle Mark visited me in the park, Lucy explained, her voice innocent and clear. Emily's face turned pale. Lucy, are you sure? Lucy nodded. Yes, Mommy. He was nice. David's breath caught in his throat. The realization that Mark had been close to his daughter without his knowledge was both terrifying and baffling. Realizing that Lucy could be the key to finding Mark, David listened at the door, out of sight. What did he look like, honey? Emily asked softly. He had a beard and weird glasses, Lucy replied with a giggle. David's thoughts raced through the bits of information. The idea that Lucy had met his estranged brother felt surreal. He knew he had to act, but he needed more details to understand the full picture. The revelation that Mark had met his daughter spurred David into action, determined to find out the truth. He could no longer ignore the urgency. Emily, I need to find him, he finally admitted, stepping into the room. Emily looked at him confused and worried. David, what's the matter? She asked. I'll explain everything quickly. But I need to find Mark, he said, his voice firm. The need for answers became his driving force. David decided to follow this new trail, even if it meant confronting painful memories and long-hidden secrets. He spent the next few hours collecting everything he knew about Mark, from old photos to anecdotes from his childhood. I'm not going to let this slip away, he murmured, determined with every move. Every clue, every memory was one step closer to the truth. He prepared for the difficult journey ahead, ready to face whatever he might discover. David wondered where Lucy could have met her estranged uncle, and concluded that it might have been in the schoolyard. The thought that Mark was so close and yet so hidden troubled him. It must have been there, he muttered, merging Lucy's casual remarks about the park and the playground. He knew he had to investigate further. His head was racing with possibilities. The playground seemed like the most logical place to start. He decided to take Monday off to babysit Lucy and maybe catch a glimpse of his brother. I'll have to see for myself, David thought firmly. He called his boss and feigned a coughing fit. I don't feel well. I need a day off. The plan was set. He would be there, watching, waiting for a sign from Mark. The idea of finally confronting his brother filled him with a mixture of fear and expectation. That weekend, David visited his mother again and asked for Mark instead of their father, hoping for answers. Mom, I need to know something about Mark, he said in a firm voice. She looked at him, her eyes tired. David, why now? She asked, but he remained determined. Because he's been in touch with Lucy, he replied. Her expression shifted, a mixture of shock and resignation. Okay, she sighed, but I can't tell you much. His mother showed visible sadness and fear, but still gave him little information about Mark. I always hoped he'd stay away, she said softly, her hands trembling. David pressed gently. Mom, anything you know can help. She shook her head, tears forming. He's changed, David. After he left, he changed, she whispered. The fear in her eyes was palpable. Please be careful, she begged. David nodded and understood the significance of her words. David's determination grew as he realized the depth of his mother's fear, and decided to find his brother himself. I'm not going to let this go, he thought, as he gained a new sense of purpose. His mother's fear only fueled his resolve. He spent the rest of the weekend preparing, going over every detail he knew about Mark. The task ahead was daunting, But David was ready. He had to find Mark, for the sake of his family. On Monday morning, David called in sick and waited for Emily to get to work before going to Lucy's school. "I don't feel well today," he said over the phone, trying to sound convincing. Once Emily and Lucy were out of the house, David grabbed his coat and keys. He had to see for himself. The truth was within his grasp, and he had no intention of passing it up. He positioned himself near the playground with a good view of both the school and the road. David found a spot behind some bushes where he could look without being seen. The morning was chilly, but he hardly noticed. His attention was fully focused on the playground. "Come on, show up," he muttered under his breath, scanning the surroundings. His heart pounded as he waited. Every minute felt like an hour. As the kids rushed outside for recess, David saw Lucy head straight to the other side of the playground. He looked at her with a mixture of fear and hope. Lucy seemed happy, her little feet carrying her with excitement. "What are you up to, my dear?" whispered David, watching her. She moved purposefully, and David's breath caught in his throat, anticipating what might happen. Moments later, a tall man who looked like David approached the fence, and Lucy ran to hug him. David's eyes widened, and his body tensed with fright. "It's him," he whispered, recognizing the man at once. The resemblance was uncanny. The same stature, the same way of moving. Lucy's reaction left no doubt. She knew him well. David felt a mixture of anger and curiosity, and couldn't take his eyes off the scene. David's blood grew cold as he watched as the man, whom he recognized as his brother Mark, hugged his daughter. The sight was unreal, as if a ghost from his past materialized for him. "Mark," he murmured, a wave of emotion washing over him. Lucy's joy contrasted sharply with David's restlessness. He clenched his fists and struggled to process the scene. His thoughts raced, filled with questions and a growing sense of urgency. David watched as Lucy and Mark chatted animatedly and laughed with each other during the break. Their conversations seemed light-hearted, filled with giggles and laughter. "Uncle Mark, look at this!" exclaimed Lucy, showing him something out of her pocket. Mark chuckled and responded enthusiastically. David's heart ached when he saw their tape. He felt like an outsider witnessing a world he wasn't a part of. The scene was both heartwarming and disturbing. When the school bell rang, Mark handed Lucy a small package and hugged her one more time before she ran back inside. David squeezed his eyes shut to see what the package was. Lucy held it tight, and her face beamed with joy. "Thanks, Uncle Mark," she shouted, and ran to the school. Mark waved with a tender smile on his face. David's stomach turned with a mix of emotions and couldn't look away. Lucy waved to Mark before entering the school, causing David's heart to ache with a mixture of love and concern. Her innocent joy contrasted sharply with the restlessness in him. "Be good, Lucy," Mark called softly. David clenched his fists, the scene tugging at his heart. He felt a protective urge, but also a deep-seated concern about what this connection meant. He knew he had to act, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. Determined to find out more, David decided to follow Mark as he left the playground. He watched as Mark turned and walked away, absorbed in the morning rush. David made up his mind quickly. "I need answers," he thought, slipping out of hiding. He kept his distance and followed him, his head racing with questions. The need to understand Mark's presence in Lucy's life drowned out his fears. At a safe distance, David followed his brother through the city, his heart pounding with anticipation. Mark moved nonchalantly, oblivious to the shadow that followed him. David ducked behind corners and peered cautiously around. "Don't lose him," he muttered to himself, adrenaline rushing through his veins. Each step brought him closer to the truth, but the weight of the secrets felt heavier with each moment. David followed Mark through the city, careful not to be discovered. He kept a safe distance, but his eyes remained on Mark. Mark walked purposefully, occasionally glancing over his shoulder. David ducked behind parked cars and slipped through doorways, his heart pounding. "Just a little more," he whispered, determined to stay hidden. The tension grew with every step, the anticipation almost unbearable. Mark eventually entered a rundown cafe in a shady part of town, causing David to hesitate. It looked dilapidated, with peeling paint and dirty windows. David's instincts cried out for caution, but his curiosity won out. "This is it," he thought, taking a deep breath. He pushed the door open, a bell ringing above his head. The dimly lit interior and smell of stale coffee greeted him as he scanned the room for Mark. David couldn't resist, went into the cafe and saw Mark in an almost hidden cubicle in the back. The cafe was mostly empty. There were a few customers scattered around. David's eyes fell on Mark, who was sitting in the shade with a cup of coffee in his hand. He slowly approached and tried to calm his heart. "There it goes," he muttered, making his way to the back. Mark didn't look up as David approached. Ignoring his growing anger, David sat down across from Mark, who greeted him quietly as if he was expecting him. "Hello, David," Mark said with a smile on his lips. David clenched his fists under the table and struggled to keep his composure. "Mark," he replied curtly, narrowing his eyes. His brother's nonchalant attitude only fueled David's frustration. "I need answers," he thought, getting ready for the confrontation. David was shocked by Mark's unexpected greeting, but he persevered and demanded answers about his daughter. "What are you doing with Lucy?" David asked, his voice barely under control. Mark took a sip of his coffee, unfazed. "Calm down, David," he said, putting the cup down. "She's safe." David's anger flared up. "That's not what I was asking." Mark's composure contrasted sharply with David's agitation. The tension between them was palpable. Mark grinned at David's shock and claimed that he had noticed that David was following him. "You're not as cunning as you think," Mark said, leaning back in his chair. David's eyes narrowed, his frustration mounted. "Why the game, Mark?" he asked. Mark shrugged, but the grin never left his face. "I wanted to see how far you'd go," he replied. David felt his patience dwindling. His brother's nonchalant attitude infuriated him even more. David wanted to know why Mark had met Lucy, and his frustration and anger mounted. "Why were you with my daughter?" he asked, his voice intensifying. Mark's expression became serious, but he remained calm. "Calm down, David," he said. "I just wanted to get to know her." David slammed his fist on the table, startling the few other guests. "That's not good enough," he spat. "I need to know the truth." Mark's casual statement that he wanted to get to know his niece only infuriated David. "You can't just show up after all these years and expect everything to be fine," David snapped. Mark sighed. "I get it, but I had to see her." David's anger flared up. "You didn't have the right." Mark leaned forward, his calm facade falling away a little. "I did what I thought was best," he said quietly, his tone bordering on defensive. David questioned Mark about his whereabouts and the reason why he had hidden in a dingy cafe. "Where have you been, Mark?" he asked. "And why here? Of all places?" Mark hesitated and looked around the room. "I've kept a low profile," he admitted. David frowned. "Why?" Mark looked at the door and then back at David. "It's complicated," he muttered. David leaned forward. "Make it simple," he urged. "I deserve to know." Mark's anxiety grew when he revealed that he didn't want their father to know he was back, which shocked David. "I didn't want Dad to find me." Mark confessed in a slightly trembling voice. David's eyes widened in disbelief. Dad? Why bother with that? Mark's gaze fell on the table. You don't understand, he said softly. David's mind raced. The pieces of the puzzle still didn't fit together. Explain, he demanded, his own concern increasing. Mark's shock when he learned that their father had died years ago convinced David of his sincerity. Is he gone? Mark's voice trembled and his face turned pale. Didn't you know that? David asked, surprised by the sincere response. Mark shook his head. I had no idea. The raw emotion in his brother's eyes told David everything he needed to know. For the first time, David felt an ounce of empathy when he realized how distant Mark had been. They talked about their father's illness and death, and how their mother refused to tell much. He got sick quickly, David began, reminiscing about the painful memories. Mom didn't tell us much, kept everything close to her chest. Mark listened intently, his eyes overshadowed by regret. I've always wondered, he said softly. David nodded. She was secretive, even to the end. The shared grief between them felt like a fragile bridge that reconnected their past. Mark scoffed at their mother's silence, hinting at deeper secrets she was hiding. Typical for Mom, he muttered. Always hiding things. David frowned. What do you mean? Mark's eyes darkened. She knew more than she let on. Always had. David felt a shiver. The implication was heavy. What aren't you telling me, Mark? He asked. Mark shook his head. I'm just saying, don't trust everything she said. The cryptic hint left David uncomfortable. David asked Mark for more information, but his brother remained cryptic and cautious. There's more to it, right? David insisted. Mark sighed and looked doubtful. Some things are better left buried, he said. David leaned forward, his frustration boiling over. Stop with those riddles, Mark. I need to know. Mark's eyes met his. A silent battle ensued. You're not ready, Mark finally said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Determined to uncover the truth, David felt even more determined to dig into their family's past. I don't care what it takes, he vowed silently. The weight of the secrets and lies weighed heavily on him. I'll find out, he declared, standing up. Mark looked at him with a mixture of pity and resignation. Good luck, he said simply. David was determined, his path clear. He needed to know, for Lucy, for himself, and for their family. David begged Mark to explain his cryptic hints, desperate for answers. Please, Mark, I need to know, David said in a cracking voice. Mark looked away. The tension was palpable. It's not that simple, David, he replied. David's frustration boiled over. Then make it simple. I can't keep living in the dark. The desperation in his voice was clear, a plea for clarity in the midst of confusion. Mark shook his head and refused to say more, prompting David to express his own fears. Why don't you tell me? David demanded. I'm afraid, Mark. Afraid to become like Dad. Mark's eyes softened, but he was silent. Your disappearance, the secrets, it's tearing me apart, David continued, his voice trembling. The raw vulnerability in his confession was in the air, a testament to his growing desperation. David confessed how Mark's disappearance had affected him, and tried to prevent him from becoming like their father. You left, and it felt like I was losing everything, he admitted. I don't want to repeat Dad's mistakes, but I'm afraid I already do. Mark's expression shifted, a mixture of surprise and regret. David, I never wanted to hurt you, he said softly. The weight of the past weighed heavily on both of them. The pain of old wounds resurfaced. Mark, shocked by David's perspective, insisted that he had never left voluntarily and urged David to follow him. "I didn't leave because I wanted to," Mark said with an urgent tone in his voice. "You have to understand that I was forced." David's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" Mark stood up. "Come with me. I'll show you." David hesitated, but then nodded. "Okay," he said, determination mixed with curiosity. Together they walked out, forming a joint decision. Together, they decided to confront their mother in search of the truth about their family's hidden past. "We need to know everything," David said as they drove. Mark nodded. "It's time." When they arrived at their mother's house, David's heart was pounding. They stood side by side at the front door, as one front against the secrets that had long divided them. Mark knocked on the door, and they waited, bracing themselves for the confrontation that awaited them. Their mother was visibly shocked when she saw David and Mark standing at her front door. "Mark? David?" she gasped, her eyes wide with fright. David stepped forward. "Mom, we need to talk." She hesitated and glanced between them. "What's this about?" she asked, her voice trembling. Mark took a deep breath. "We need answers." Their mother nodded slowly and stepped aside to let them in, her face pale with fear. Mark demanded the truth about his disappearance and their father's secrets. "Why did Daddy force me to leave?" he asked, his voice tight with anger. Their mother's hands trembled as she clasped them. "It's complicated," she began. David said, "We deserve to know, Mom." The room fell silent. The tension was great. Mark's eyes bored into her. "Tell us everything." Their mother took a deep breath, ready to reveal the long-hidden truth. With tears in her eyes, their mother confessed that their father was involved in a crime gang. "Your father was involved in dangerous things," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. David and Mark exchanged shocked looks. "What kind of things?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "He was part of a crime gang," she said, her voice breaking. The weight of her confession hung heavy in the air, shattering the illusions they had about their father. She revealed that Mark had seen something dangerous, which led to his banishment by their father. "Mark saw something he shouldn't have seen," she said in a trembling voice. Mark nodded, his face pale. "I saw Father with dangerous people," he said softly. Their mother continued, "Your father was afraid that Mark would get hurt, or worse." David's anger flared up. "So did he send him away?" She nodded. "He thought it was the only way to keep him safe." Stunned, David and Mark reconciled, welcoming Mark into David's family and beginning to repair their relationship with their mother. "I'm sorry for everything," Mark said, his voice full of emotion. David hugged him tightly. "We'll figure it out together." Their mother looked on with tears of relief. "Can we start again?" she asked softly. David nodded. "We can try." As they stood together, the healing process began, united by the truth and their renewed bond.